So, what exactly should you do if you are unlucky enough to experience a major earthquake? Well, for starters, it's always good to remember that being prepared is the best policy.
If you live in a part of the world that is prone to earthquakes, or you are planning on spending a significant amount of time in such a place, formulating a plan of action ahead of time may be the key to your survival in case the worst happens. First of all, get to know your surroundings. Figure out the safest places to take cover in your home or place of work. Learn how to turn off your electricity, gas, and water supplies. And also identify evacuation routes and an agreed upon meeting point. You could also make your home safer during an earthquake by securing large pieces of furniture to the wall, making sure any large heavy objects are placed on lower shelves.
So, you and your home are now fully prepped. It's time to learn what to do when an earthquake actually strikes.
The best course of action depends somewhat on your circumstances in the moment, so let's run through a few different scenarios. If you're outside in an open space, sitting down and waiting it out is often all you need to do. While the largest earthquakes can cause the ground to shake for several minutes, fortunately these are very rare. The vast majority of earthquakes generally only last between 10 and 30 seconds, so sit down, hold on, and stay calm. If you're outside but near any large structures, as well as things like utility poles, overhead cables, or trees, it's best to move as far away from these as quickly as you can, before planting yourself on the ground. Falling objects and debris are one of the most common causes of injury during an earthquake, so if you can't fully distance yourself from nearby structures, keep an eye out for anything high up that looks like it might tumble down on top of you. If you happen to have anything to hand that you can shield yourself with, hold it above you to protect your head and neck. While you wait for the shaking to stop, stay outside and do not enter any buildings. If you are in a moving vehicle during an earthquake, stop as soon as you can in a safe location. Again, this means somewhere away from things like buildings, streetlights, trees, and certainly do not park underneath any bridges or overhead roads, for reasons that should be fairly obvious. Stay inside and apply the handbrake. A car may jiggle pretty vigorously during an earthquake, but this is actually a pretty good place to be in such a situation. Turn on the radio and listen out for any emergency broadcasts, and when it's safe to drive again, watch out for any hazards created by the earthquake that may not have been there only seconds before. This includes large cracks or trenches in the road, sinkholes, displaced earth, fallen traffic lights, utility poles or streetlights, trees, and collapsed buildings or bridges. By the way, if you are near a beach or shoreline when an earthquake occurs, it is important that you quickly move away from the water as soon as the initial shaking has stopped. Earthquakes that strike close to or in the ocean can trigger tsunamis, which can cause extreme amounts of damage and kill survivors of the initial quake. As soon as the shaking stops, immediately try to move at least 3 kilometers inland or 30 meters above sea level in order to avoid potentially deadly tsunami waves. Though it is not present in every case, a classic sign of an approaching tsunami is the sudden and unexpected recession of the sea that cannot be explained by low tides. You may also hear a loud rumble or roaring noise emanating from the ocean, similar to that of a train or jet aircraft, which often precedes a large wave.
If you notice any of these signs, whether you felt an earthquake beforehand or not, run. If you're inside when an earthquake hits, take the following action to give yourself the best chance of avoiding injury.
First of all, stay where you are. As much as you may want to immediately sprint for the exit, experts generally advise against running outside or into different rooms, as the area around exterior walls and doorways are often the most dangerous parts of a building during the actual shaking of an earthquake. This is because the risk of falling objects and shattering windows is highest in these places. You really don't want to be in range of any plummeting masonry or flying shards of glass. Not only that, if you're in a crowded building when an earthquake begins, and everyone makes for the exit, it could create a human crush or blockage at pretty much the worst possible time. Additionally, if you're on the upper floors of a high-rise building when a quake occurs, absolutely do not use the elevators under any circumstances. Though not every building will collapse during an earthquake, they may still end up considerably deformed and warped, and you really don't want to be stuck inside a misshapen elevator shaft if you could have just waited the shaking out and used the stairs. With all that in mind, as soon as the shaking begins, quickly move away from any large pieces of furniture, shelves, or light fixtures that could fall, particularly those that are especially heavy or made of glass. If you can, take cover underneath a sturdy table, desk or bed. Hold on to your cover and be prepared to move with it to stay under its protection throughout the earthquake. If there is no cover available, move as close as you can to an interior wall with no windows and crouch down onto your knees with your hands covering your head and neck. Again, if there's anything like a book or a tray within reach, you can use that to shield yourself from falling objects or glass. If you are in a wheelchair and cannot get onto the ground, lock your wheels and cover your head and neck. Additionally, if an earthquake strikes at night while you're in bed, it's best to hold on and stay where you are, protecting your head with a pillow.
On the topic of taking cover, we really need to look at some of the frequently suggested earthquake survival advice that are actually good examples of the sort of misinformation we here at Debunked love to, well, debunk.
Like this guy, you may have heard that one of the best places to be during an earthquake is in a doorway. And in fact, this is indeed where quite a lot of people stand and steady themselves when everything starts to shake. Don't do this.
This is a common misconception about earthquake safety that actually puts you at a greater risk.
It is believed that this nugget of bad advice originated with the Spanish missions in the Americas. At this time, the walls of many buildings were built from adobe, which is literally just earth and other biological material. When earthquakes struck in this era, often the wooden door frames were the most likely part of these structures to be left standing, which has been propagated through the years as a belief that doorways are the strongest part of a building. While this may have been the case back in 19th century California, modern building practices, i.e. not building everything out of dirt and straw, mean that these days doorways are no stronger than any other part of a building, and in fact may even constitute a weak point. Not only that, standing in a doorway rather than heading for cover leaves you exposed on both sides to all the aforementioned falling debris and shattering glass. Not good.
Another piece of earthquake misinformation you may have heard of goes by the rather grandiose name of the Triangle of Life, which was conceived by a fellow called Doug Kopp, having entered public awareness through a series of viral emails. Never a good sign.
The Triangle of Life asserts that during an earthquake, people should position themselves next to large, bulky pieces of furniture or cars, rather than taking cover under things like tables and desks. This is because when buildings fully collapse on top of the objects and furniture inside, they compress them to a certain extent, but leave a small, often triangular void at its side. The theory claims that a person is more likely to survive if they position themselves to end up in this void, rather than taking cover under tables that would be completely crushed under the weight of a building.
While there is a modicum of validity to this idea, it is based on a rather narrow set of circumstances and assumptions that do not reflect the reality of what actually happens in most earthquakes.
First of all, this advice only really pertains to people unlucky enough to be trapped following a complete pancake-style collapse of the building they were in. This is actually quite rare outside of only the least developed parts of the world, where buildings are often very old and structurally unsound. In the case of most earthquakes, the vast majority of buildings do not fully collapse, and when they don't, falling objects and breaking glass are much more likely to cause injury and death. Opting for the Triangle of Life tactic in these circumstances is ineffective and puts you at greater risk, not less.
It's also not always possible to tell exactly where these life-saving triangular voids will be in the event of a total structural collapse.
As you can imagine, disintegrating buildings are pretty unpredictable, and in reality, it's almost impossible to know exactly where such a space will materialize, if it does at all. The Triangle of Life approach also doesn't consider the possibility of being crushed between heavy objects as the result of side-to-side movement. For these reasons, Kopp's Triangle of Life strategy has been roundly criticized and rejected by a number of organizations, such as the American Red Cross, the South California Earthquake Center, and the Structural Engineers Association of California, to name but a few. As a result, we here at Debunked advise you to take the drop, cover, and hold on for dear life approach to indoor earthquake survival.
Unfortunately, even if you do everything right, it's entirely possible you may still end up trapped underneath debris and rubble. Obviously, this is a frightening and stressful experience, but if you do find yourself trapped, try to stay calm and do not panic.
One of the most effective ways to let rescuers know that there are survivors who need help is to tap on hard, resonant materials, such as metal poles. Rescue teams will often have moments of silence to listen for faint noises underneath the rubble, and people are sometimes saved by this method.
If you manage to survive an earthquake relatively unscathed, there are still things you can do to help yourself and others after the shaking has stopped. First, check yourself for any injuries that you may not have immediately noticed in the initial chaos, particularly cuts caused by broken glass.
When the quake has fully subsided, it is now much safer to move around and exit a building. Listen out for any emergency broadcasts for up-to-date information, and consult with any emergency services present on what to do next, particularly if you notice any structural damage to your home and consider it to be unsafe. Also, be prepared for aftershocks caused by the initial quake. Though these smaller quakes are often less intense and steadily decrease in magnitude and frequency over time, they can sometimes be sufficiently powerful to cause further destruction and injury, especially during rescue operations.
Now you know how best to protect yourself in the case of a powerful earthquake. While we hope that you never actually have to use this information, it's always better to have the knowledge and not need it, than to need it and not have it. Stay safe, folks.